This is Christina from Proverbs 31 Homestead. Thanks for joining me today. I thought I would show you what my no-till garden looks like. I created it this spring, and this is sort of it's mid-September, but maybe the garden seems a little bit more like a late summer garden than a fall garden, but some of that is just where I live and the types of things that I grow. My purpose here is to show you not only how great this method really works of laying down cardboard and then either compost or good soil and mulch, but also to show you maybe some of my failures, because they do happen even when you've been gardening a very long time like I have. And maybe some of the things also to look out for when you do use this method. So I'm going to take you over here to the other end of the garden. We're going to start there. One of the things I love about gardening is that I'm always learning. I think you could be a gardener your whole life and still learn, and I find that exciting. And certainly this garden has had a few things in it that have not been optimal. Here's one of them. So my husband built this lovely cattle panel trellis, and originally I planted yard-long beans down here and cucumbers over on this side. Now if you look at the other side, you can see that the cucumbers, which are right there, did great on that side, and it looks like the beans did really well here, but there's a story about that. So my yard-long beans did nothing. They sat there and looked miserable forever. So later than I normally would have, I planted some regular pole green beans. I think these are Vortex. And they grew, they're producing on this side. You know, they were planted late, so they don't look fabulous. So you can see that even though I planted those same green beans on this side and the same cucumbers, this whole side of the cattle panel did horribly. At first I thought it might have been exposure, maybe it was getting a lot more wind, but I believe, even though I have not yet tested the soil, that the problem was the soil I brought in. So the soil in general was terrific, but when you buy good garden soil, it's mixed with compost, mixed with manure. Sometimes it's not perfectly mixed. I would say most of the time. You're going to get patches of it where there's a little too much nitrogen, the manure is a little hot still, or just it's deficient in one area or another. And I think that's what happened on this side of the cattle panel. So amazingly, I have gotten some cucumbers off these little tiny plants. And there are some green beans growing over here. It's not a total loss, but next year I'm going to be adding more soil and mixing in. I'll test that soil, make sure that all the nutrients we need for the plants are there. And then I should next year have a beautiful garden trellis. I also want to show you, see, I have these big weeds growing in the pathways sometimes, especially right here. That's dock. Dock you can't really not pull out. So what I have been doing, as you can see, not all my pathways have mulch on them now. My goal is before winter to do that. Is I just cut off the leaves at the soil level, and I do that over and over again. And most weeds will die if you do that enough, but the dock, which is a native weed here and is edible, has been doing that. The big thing is to make sure it's not getting into the areas, in this case I do berms, where you've planted your vegetables. Okay, now I want to show you where most of my tomatoes are. So this was a really lousy year for us weather-wise. Everything was cooler than usual. We normally have some pretty hot days in the summer. We did not get that this year. And the tomatoes really suffered. They need a specific temperature to flower and a specific temperature to get fruit, and for that fruit to ripen especially. But I am getting some tomatoes. I did buy tomatoes for making my yearly, well, sometimes it's yearly, sometimes it's every other year, salsa. They were local, but from a hotter part of our state. But you can see the plants do have some. And these plants, I admit, I sort of neglected, in part because I knew I wasn't going to get the big crop I hoped for, but also I've just been working so hard on preserving food this year. And honestly, it's been a lot for one person to do. And so while I pruned my tomatoes just to let more light in, hoping that that would help ripen some things. Normally I don't prune tomatoes, but these kind of went hog wild. They really like this soil. I did it and they almost instantly needed it again, and I used a Florida weave kind of thing for tomato quote cages. These are an indeterminate variety called Legend that grows really well here and doesn't mind a little bit of cooler weather. And I didn't keep up very well, and so my tomatoes are laying on the ground. But that's okay. We're going to harvest what we need to. And here's a little tip for if you do have green tomatoes. Yes, there are things you can do with them. You can make chutneys, and you can, you know, make fried green tomatoes and things like that. But if you would prefer to have them ripen, you can absolutely do that. You pick them out of the garden before it gets real rainy because you don't want them to crack. And then you are going to put them in a single layer, someplace dark, like a cupboard is great, or if you have a dark closet, something like that. And slowly over time, they will ripen, and you can have fresh tomatoes going into December that way. They won't be quite as good as a vine ripened tomato for sure, but they're better than store-bought. And what I've been doing is freezing these as they ripen. We use some fresh, but there's too many to just use fresh. So I just throw them in a freezer bag in the freezer, don't peel them, don't do anything to them. And then later on, when I have a quantity of them, I'll make crushed tomatoes for canning. Here is another view of the cucumbers, which I guess I'm kind of bad about trellising things, huh? But I've gotten lots of pickling cucumbers off of this. And then here are the green beans. These are really long variety, you can see. I've kind of come to think that the yard-long beans just aren't going to grow well in our area. I've tried a couple of times, and I thought in the past that it was due to growing them in like pots or containers, but I think we just don't get enough warmth for them. And here's a few more tomatoes that are really all over the ground. Bad, Christina. And then I have a squash hill. So when I was trying to get this garden in the spring, of course, it seems like I never get things done early. So I was rushing to get things done, and I ran out of cardboard, which I guess if you haven't seen my video on creating this garden, you should go watch that. But briefly, what we did is we either mowed down or tilled down weeds. We try not to till because it's not great for the soil. And then I layered 2 layers of corrugated cardboard down, and then I either put mulch on top of that for the walkways, or I put garden soil that I purchased because our native soil is horrific on top. So I had run out of cardboard, and I had a little heap here of soil. So I just decided to plant squash. It was very last minute. But they've done very well. I've got some, let's see if I can show you. This is called Slick Pick. It is a sort of a typical summer squash with a little bit of a green tint. It's grown very, very well. My only complaint is I do think it is a little milder than your standard yellow squash. And also, it does not last very long on the counter, so you want to use it pretty quickly. Then I've got some patty pan, which, oh, can you see? Yeah, there we go. Patty pan, we love these. I prick them with a fork, microwave them, or maybe put them in the oven if you prefer. Slice them horizontally, salt and pepper, and a pat of butter, and oh my goodness, they're yummy. We've gotten lots off of those. And over here, I had some freebie seeds that somebody had given me for something called a lemon squash. And it is pretty good. Pretty good. Again, it doesn't last that long on the counter. You can see I have lots of mushrooms growing in this garden. Wild mushrooms that are unedible, but just show that the soil is really rich. Okay, now this is the first proper berm, I guess you would say. And you can see I sort of threw a yellow squash here on the very end. It didn't have very much soil, and yet it has produced quite a bit of squash. This whole berm right now is cabbages. I wish I could tell you the variety. I don't remember. I also had interplanted some either broccoli or cauliflower, or maybe a little bit of both. And it worked out pretty well that those matured before these cabbages got huge. I love the way cabbages look in the garden. This one is heading now. This one hasn't yet. There's another one that has headed. They look beautiful, and we have been eating all the leaves. You can eat all those outer leaves as well. They're just a little tougher. You can steam them. I've been slicing them and using them for sauerkraut. This berm, most of what I had originally planted is now gone. Well, actually it all is. This again was cauliflower and broccoli, both of which are essentially, especially the cauliflower in my garden. I pulled the last one just a few days ago. So I put in for fall, I put in some broccoli, and it's just been growing really, really slow. So it will probably not do anything for me, but if it's not too harsh a winter, it will overwinter, and if I'm lucky in the fall, or excuse me, in the spring, it will produce leaves and maybe a head. We eat the leaves and the stems and everything. The other little plants that you see throughout, these are radishes. They grow super fast, so they're a great fall garden crop. And I think this is a lettuce over here. I have a really hard time growing lettuce here. I've grown it many times in other places, but here we get a lot of hot, cold, and it wants to go to seed. All these green beans here are planted maybe a month ago or so to replace the broccoli and cauliflower, and they are producing. Over here we have beets, and then these are some leftover turnips. I planted them in the spring. I could pick them anytime. You can see, I want you to look and see how bug eaten these are too. I'm going to show you that with some of the other, I don't know if you can, if I'm getting a good shot. Some of these look like lace. I'm going to show you with some of the cabbage too, that is the case. This to me, my friends, is a sign of an organic garden. I really don't worry too much about it. We'll talk more about that in a minute. I have a few onions that just weren't quite ready to pick yet. They're probably, I could pick them anytime now. I have, it's either a cabbage or a broccoli. I did try to plant some, it's called baby cauliflower, I think in here someplace. And the thought was it's supposed to grow fast, even though it's a smaller head, it would grow fast for fall, but it really, I don't think it's my first time growing that variety, and I don't think it likes our conditions. Now this crazy pile here, that, my friends, is a combination of broccoli that has not headed yet, and there's a little bit of kale in there too. I keep hoping maybe I'll get a head on that broccoli. I've never seen broccoli do that before, so that's a first for me. Over here, so I planted zucchini not in this garden but elsewhere in our yard, and I planted 3 seeds in a wine barrel and they all came up. So once this plant was fairly large, I took it, you know, like bigger than you would buy a seedling in a store. I took it out of that wine barrel and planted it here and totally expected it not to do well, but it's given me tons of zucchini. It's getting overgrown by all this broccoli, but it's still producing. These are more green beans that I planted to replace I think it was cabbage right here. And it is producing right now. Then I've got another lettuce, and these are broccoli. And then there's some more beets. Beets didn't do great this year, which really surprised me. They're a cool season crop. You would think they would have liked our conditions, but not really. I want to point out this. That is a bit of stem and the root off a cabbage that I harvested, I think, yesterday. And when I can, I will just leave those in there. If you think in the soil instead of pulling them out, if you think about all the nutrients that are in those roots, it's a great idea to just leave them in the soil so that as they decompose, it feeds the soil and the surrounding plants. I also want to point out all that lovely blackberry. So where we live, these blackberries are really highly invasive, and I knew no matter what method of gardening I chose, these were going to be a headache. But I have been pleasantly surprised at how easily I can pull this out. Look at that. I mean, yeah, there is a little bit of root left, no matter what you do with this type of blackberry. You are going to have some root in the soil. But normally you cannot just pull it out of the soil like that. You would have to dig it out. And so I've been pleasantly surprised at how easy it's been to weed the blackberries out of the beds or anywhere where there's like mulch down. So that is a great sign. And this winter we will be coming out at least weekly to pull those to make sure that they don't overtake this garden. Okay. Ooh, getting a sprinkle here. So this bed is kale, and you'll see also some cabbage, some smaller heads, and let's see, I think down here at the end there's some cabbage heads. I'm going to go back a little bit this way. So here's a section. This, I think, shows how great this method really is. So I have a section here where I barely had any cardboard, barely had any soil down. I truly, people, not even an inch of soil. And I went ahead in my crazy way and I planted pumpkin seeds. And I am actually getting some lovely pumpkins. Look at that. This is not a huge variety, but let me just show you. There's my hand. I have never successfully, in my mind, grown pumpkin before. So it was kind of funny to me that when it had so little soil, it actually thrived. This is just one vine. And then over here, planted in slightly more soil, is a butternut, squash, and here, let's see if I can show you some squash. There's one in there, but there's a lot throughout here. If I can just find them. There we go. Where I live, I find it really difficult to bring these squash to full maturity. I have gotten one small one, so I guess that's a victory. Then in here I planted, you notice I have planted pretty intensively, and you'll notice that especially where you can see where I planted in the spring. And it's worked out really well. The plants shade each other, so, even though they're planted close together, which theoretically means that they would need more water, they also shade each other, so less water is evaporated, which is a big deal where I live because we have quite a bit of wind. It also helps keep weeds down, which is nice. So anyway, these are Brussels sprouts. You can see, this one just is barely starting to get little baby Brussels sprouts. And there's also some summer squash in there, which I'll show you. There's one of them. It's produced well. And over here, cabbages on the very end. And it's okay with me that sometimes, see, this was planted in the spring and it's teeny weeny. And this was planted in the spring at the same time, and it's almost ready to harvest. I could really harvest it any time. And others in the garden planted at the same time are much bigger, and that's okay. I like that. It means that I don't have to harvest everything at once and figure out what to do with it. So here again is that bed with the cabbages and the kale, and you can see there's no pathway in between. It's just become a jungle. And these are Brussels sprouts again, which the aphids have started to attack. But usually I can battle them enough that it doesn't really matter too much. Okay. I thought this at the very end was kind of interesting. So I have been watering with a hose. And the reason for that, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is I didn't want to use a sprinkler because I didn't want to water weeds in this brand new garden, you know? I want to get the weeds under good control. The second was I didn't want to go and spend a bunch of money on soaker hoses right now, and I may change things about this garden layout for next year. You know, it just didn't seem to make sense. So even though it takes a lot of time, I've been hand watering. Well, my hoses, it's been hard to reach the ends of the beds. So I want you to see the difference here between this Brussels sprout, which is easily gets water, and the Brussels sprouts over there that don't get much water. What a huge, huge difference. Irrigation is important. We don't get rain typically in the summer, so my neighbor was noting this. You know, he has a garden that he just kind of throws things in the ground and he kind of ignores them. And he was just marveling at my garden, and part of it is he's using native soil, but some of it is the irrigation, I believe, as well. Over here, I always had a big long line of green beans. I went through and I harvested everything I could from these. These are provider bush beans. And then I replanted. They have not flowered yet, but they're getting close. I'm sure I'll get at least a few harvests out of that before the frost. And on the very end, this looks like a gardening mistake, right? These plants look awful. But these are green beans that I never picked. I let them fully mature so that I could collect the seeds. I got a huge amount of seeds from them. More than I really intended, but hey, that's all right. The ones that are left, this one I could probably harvest. You want them to be papery. So, getting back to the holes in the leaves here, you can see these are my cabbages. They're pretty holy. I'm sure there are probably worse examples elsewhere. But this is part of organic gardening. I don't just automatically kill bugs that are in my garden or that start eating in my garden. I wait and see if we can both live out of the garden. That way it's less work for me, it's better for the environment, it allows nature to balance itself, hopefully. And I'm not using any weird chemicals, because even a lot of the chemicals that are considered organic, they're still chemicals. So, you know, I try not to use them. And I guess it takes some experience to know whether those pests are going to ruin your garden or not. I have enough experience to know that generally the slugs and snails, as long as they're not getting to the little seedlings, they're not going to kill the plant or make it inharvestable for me. Is that a word, inharvestable? Aphids, on the other hand, I have to catch immediately. And I always try to use hand picking first, or washing the aphids away in that case, before I use anything else. And usually that's enough. And if you're really brave, you let the pests take control one year and you see if predators come around, or you can introduce predators sometimes. It's hard. Let me fully admit that that's hard, because you have worked really hard on your garden. Maybe you really rely on it for food for your family. But if you can do that, nature has a way of balancing itself. And look, we're getting rain, so I may not have to water the garden this morning. Next year, I do hope to expand this at least a little bit. Like I said, I've been kind of overwhelmed with preserving, and it's not the gardening part that takes so long. It is the, preserving the food. So we'll see. I do want to expand a little bit. I want to put in some different kinds of onions and garlic and some things like that. Over here, this is the beginnings of my laying down mulch and cardboard for the walkways, so that in the winter when we get lots of rain, the weeds don't go crazy. It's just a pile of chips. We can get those free. and some of the cardboard laid down. And I also wanted to point out this right here. This is a manure pile. So I have bins that I put rabbit manure in. And when those all get full, then my husband carts these down to the garden, because this is where I'm going to use them, right? So it's good to have the pile here. And I've also put some things that can just compost here that aren't going to attract bears, I don't think. You know, some squash that didn't get fully pollinated, so it was rotting, and some outer leaves of some plants. And the final thing I want to show you is this lovely table that my husband built. Super simple, but what this allows me to do is to take especially like root vegetables, and I can just lay them down here, run water over the roots, and the soil stays in the garden, which is better for the garden, and it keeps the soil out of my septic system and out of my kitchen. So this was a really handy dandy thing. I'm real pleased with it. If you have any questions at all about this garden or your garden, please let me know. See you next time. Bye.